Now we'll hear from Professor Cordero from the Department of Sociology and Urban Education at City University of New York, the Graduate School and University Center. Prior to joining the Marx School at CUNY, Dr. Cordero was a program officer in the Economic Development and the Quality Employment Units of the Asset Building and Community Development Program at the Ford Foundation.
Thank you, Andrew, and thanks to board members for the opportunity to present here and for the nice setup following Randy's thoughtful passion and Desmond's very measured and well thought out comments. I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the relationship between work, poverty, and welfare, which has come up numerous times this morning and before in debates about Puerto Rico. And in spite of significant progress over the previous century, Puerto Rico remains a low-income U.S. territory. And in the last decade, we have been losing the fight against poverty. And I'd like to add that I think the fight against poverty is something that we can all kind of join in saying it's something we agree should continue to happen. The incidence and experience of poverty in Puerto Rico varies significantly by age, and children are much more likely to live in poverty compared to persons in older age groups. As the economic crisis in Puerto Rico and the various reports that describe it continue to attract media interest, a number of myths about Puerto Rico's labor supply have gained traction. The Kruger report is a good example, as it argues that, and I'm not just trying to pinpoint on that report. I think these are arguments that one hears in common discourse in Puerto Rico, and I want to try to address them too. There's some perception that Puerto Rico has low levels of education, some perception that people in Puerto Rico do not want to work, and there's low labor supply, that welfare payments are somehow too generous, that welfare is a disincentive to work, and people can get welfare easily, that the minimum wage and labor laws are somehow too generous and should be reduced, and that somehow this cocktail or combination of low-wage workers, the poor, and other vulnerable populations are too costly and unproductive and to blame for the financial and economic crisis of Puerto Rico. Let me try to address each of those points as briefly as I can in the 300 seconds I have left. First, Puerto Rico's made significant gains in education, and Randy spoke eloquently about it. And let me just summarize the 2 or 3 slides I have on education with one sentence. If there is one major indicator where Puerto Rico and the U.S. have converged over the last century, it's in levels of education. End of story. We can spend the next 20 minutes talking about it, but that's a convergence, positive story. Significant progress in education levels and human capital in Puerto Rico, however, have not translated into more secure and stable employment, better pay and better wages, growing incomes, and significantly lower poverty levels for the island. Since 2006, Puerto Rican economy and labor market have collapsed, and you can forward the slide if you'd like, from a peak of over 1.4 million persons in the labor force to slightly over 1.1 million in 2017, and the number of employed hovering around less than 1 million workers. So what happened in 2006? Did Puerto Ricans decide one day to the next to change their labor supply behavior? Did they all decide to stop working, join welfare, or migrate at the same time? No, there was a significant policy change in DC, which in addition to a US recession, and you can move to the next slide if you'd like, caused and cemented the collapse in the Puerto Rico labor market. This is a labor demand story, not a labor supply story. Whether you are for or against Section 936, whether it's politically convenient or not, it's a fact that the demand for labor in Puerto Rico collapsed. To properly understand and compare labor force participation, and you can move on, those are manufacturing jobs, again, that you can see clearly collapse, and the timing of it is quite clear. You can move forward if you'd like. And you can see the effects of that collapse in all sectors of the economy and all segments because of the spillover effects that have been discussed here this morning. So let me move to the next point about whether welfare benefits in Puerto Rico are too generous, and you can move forward. That's the labor force participation rate in Puerto Rico that clearly collapsed after 2006. Please move forward, and please move forward. Next slide, please. Thank you. I don't need you to see the numbers. What I want you to see here is the benefit levels in Puerto Rico. One column is the number of months on average that Puerto Ricans on welfare spend, and the next column is the average monthly benefits of welfare recipients in Puerto Rico. You can move to the next slide. I graphed it, and when you graph it, you can see that Puerto Rico is in the low quadrant, meaning low average months on welfare and low monthly benefit levels. Welfare payments in Puerto Rico are low compared to other states and the cost of living in Puerto Rico. Next slide, please. Average payments in PAN, the Nutritional Assistance Program, are between $112 and $138 per month. And close to 56% of units and 26% of individuals are in one-person units receiving about $138.70 per month. And we all deal with numbers on a regular basis. You tell me whether $138 per month plus some other loose change programs will really add up to an incentive to stay at home over working. The calculations that purport to show that welfare pays more than work require really Olympic assumptions, including that everyone gets the maximum of every program, and that is just not the case in fact. PAN is the biggest program at about 1.3 million cases, but TANF, Section 8, and others are much, much smaller. You need to factor in the probability that the person would get the aid in order for the calculation to be realistic. Yes, if I win the lottery, I'll become a millionaire, but you have to factor in the probability that I'll actually win the lottery. So programs, as this graph clearly shows, worked as they were supposed to operate. The red line is the collapse in employment. The blue line is the increase in program participation. And what you want from these programs is when the economy collapses, that people take up because they're losing jobs. So as employment collapsed, caseloads increase and then leveled off and then decrease. So in fact, that's the PAN program where the same relationship obtains. The employment market collapses and you see take-up in the program going up at about 6-month lag. So given, next slide, so given caseloads going down in a time of a crisis is actually a puzzle. Why are caseloads going down in the middle of our recession is something we need to interrogate. So given these declines, I was surprised to see the board's memo on December 20th, the March 9th letter, the 7/30/17 report suggesting converting welfare programs into some kind of earned income tax credit, which again is a different thing. We all for a federally subsidized earned income tax credit, but to change and tweak with the programs in Puerto Rico requires much more study and much more detailed analysis before jumping into that kind of a proposal, particularly because these income tax credits are contingent upon having earned taxable income. And when there are no jobs, people can't earn taxable income. So if we examine TANF participants, next slide, by gender, age, and disability, we realize that there are a very small proportion of the population and almost no able-bodied males. Move to the next slide, please, which shows that in the entire island of Puerto Rico, there are a total of 640 able-bodied males in the welfare program. I repeat, 640. Puerto Rico has 1.6 million people under poverty. The next slide, please. PAN is the biggest program that has many more able-bodied participants, both male and female. And there is, next slide over, an employment status category in the data coded for every case. That's 1.2 million PAN cases. What's their employment status? So in the next slide, I took out all the children and elderly people and just left the people 18 to 64 years of age. And there are about 560,000 PAN participants that are between 18 and 64. And in the next slide, I classified their employment status into several categories. And keep an eye on the yellow line. Next slide, please. The single biggest category of employment status of participants in the PAN program is looking for work, 38%. The next biggest category is working at 14%. The age category includes people that are younger than 21 years of age and older than 60. Disabled includes people that participate in some kind of substance abuse or a treatment program. Family includes people that are taking care of children, that are pregnant, that are taking care of elderly, that are disabled, or children that are disabled. And 41,000 are students, and 7%. So participants in the PAN program then are looking for work, but there are no jobs, and the jobs that are there don't pay. Puerto Rico already has the lowest wages in the nation, and I just, again, don't need you to see the numbers. I just need to see where Puerto Rico is located when the wages are arranged from the highest wages to the lowest wages. Puerto Rico is about $9.42, or 56% of the nation's median hourly wage, and it has a significant gap. There's a significant proportion in the next slide of workers in Puerto Rico that are working at the minimum wage. So Puerto Rico's problem is not that the wages are too high. Puerto Rico is a low-wage, low-pay economy, and Puerto Rico's main employment problem and challenge is not that wages are too high, but that the wages are too low, and many in the population often have to shift between formal and informal employment, have multiple jobs in order to be able to survive and make ends meet. Areas in Puerto Rico with high wage and salary income in the next slide, the next one over. Areas in Puerto Rico with higher wage and salary income also tend to have higher employment. In the next slide, the observed positive relationship between wages and employment also obtains when we examine data at the state level. That's Puerto Rico alone by itself as a low-wage, low-employment area. And you can see where all the other states are. The highest the employment level in the state, the higher the wages, or the higher the wages, the higher the employment level. So you can increase Puerto Rico's participation rate by lowering wages, but why send Puerto Rico on its lonely path where there's already a road that is true and tried? How low do wages have to go in Puerto Rico before they actually go up? And we see an increase in income, standards of living, and employment levels. There's severe inequalities between Puerto Rico and the states, where there's also a lot of inequality inside Puerto Rico, and that's something that I haven't heard mentioned. Who takes what is produced on the island? The data show that the bottom 20% in Puerto Rico takes 1% of the income. The bottom 40% takes 9% of the income. The top 20% takes 55% of the income. And the top 5% takes 25% of the income. So you can churn the machine, but if you don't change the machinery inside and how it's going to be distributed, you're still going to continue to create a serious poverty problem. And the next slide. The push forces collapsing Puerto Rico's economy: low work, low pay, low returns to human capital, cuts in services, and the pool of better wages, better living conditions, and more access to economic opportunity are changing the shrinking Puerto Rico's population. The lower bar by age, from 16 to 65, the red line is how much a person makes in Puerto Rico. The blue line is how much a Puerto Rican makes in the United States. The average Puerto Rican living in the mainland U.S. is expected to earn about $640,000 more between the ages of 16 and 65 compared to the average Puerto Rican on the island. And guess what, my friends? Lowering the wages on the island and decreasing working conditions is just going to increase that gap. When you lower the red bar, you're not doing anything to the blue bar other than increasing the gap for the average Puerto Rican that can see their future and see clearly a low-wage economy on the island and the opportunity for more earnings with the same human capital on the mainland. Next slide, please. That's Puerto Rico's population pyramid. And as we can clearly see, the combined effects as people live in large numbers, the size and composition of the population in Puerto Rico are also changing dramatically. And next slide over. That's the ages where Puerto Rico's losing population, and at the top are the ages where Puerto Rico's gaining population. Next slide over. So the UN predicts that Puerto Rico is going to lose population dramatically, and what you have in the lines is what the UN predicts. What you have in the dot is where Puerto Rico actually is. So Puerto Rico's 20 years ahead of the most optimistic of the UN scenarios, and the loss of population is dramatically. So let me close by talking about Hurricane Maria, which brought about significant devastation to the local infrastructure. But one of the regular features that we see when storms come in is that three things happen. One, the poorest and most disadvantaged residents are more vulnerable. They're exposed to severe consequences in their neighborhoods, their homes, and their bodies. Second, the poor and more disadvantaged get help and sustained resources last. And third, which we need to avoid, is reconstruction efforts treat the poor and the disadvantaged as some kind of nuisance, some kind of inconvenience, and some kind of an afterthought. And we need to do better, and the U.S. citizens of Puerto Rico deserve much, much better. And now we see that the future of Puerto Rico is again being decided in D.C. with minimum involvement and consent from the governed and those whose lives will be most affected by these decisions. If there was one week that truly illustrates the dependency and vulnerability of Puerto Rico and that labor demand is what drives the process, this week is it. You can cut wages, you can cut welfare, you can eliminate labor laws, you can eliminate labor rights, and that will not give you the economic growth that Puerto Rico needs. Puerto Rico needs policies that attack poverty and attack the root causes of poverty. What we know from our research is that the best anti-poverty policy and program is a good job in a thriving economy. So let me be very clear, there is no social science evidence to support the notion that the collapse in Puerto Rico's labor market and the economy, accelerated since 2006, are the result either of the actions of poor people in Puerto Rico or the programs that have been designed to provide some minimal aid and support to the most marginalized segments of the population. Those looking for simple answers or for someone to blame for the crisis need to look elsewhere, perhaps at themselves, when trying to find the causes and culprits of Puerto Rico's economic, social, fiscal, demographic, and political crises. And I could spend the next 20 minutes giving you some solutions, but I know my time is up. Maybe I'll entertain them in the Q&A session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hector. We'll hear